chapter 9 of 2nd Chronicles is going to end the Solomon section, which began in chapter 1. In many ways, it's also going to mark the end of David's reign as well, because David and Solomon are portrayed positively, and afterward, it's going to be a very mixed bag with the rest of the kings. It's legitimate to take David and Solomon together, which of course is a large section of Chronicles spanning from 1st Chronicles chapter 10 all the way here into chapter 9 of 2nd Chronicles. In fact, even on a word level, Labuschagne points out that it is a multiple of a divine number, I think even on a verse level as well. And of course, this being the end of these multiple sections, but especially the Solomon section, as we've noted before, there's a very chiastic structure going on to the Solomon section. So, as you might imagine, we are going to repeat some themes that we saw at the very beginning. So again, we're going to get Gentile inclusion, international recognition, the wisdom of Solomon, the wealth of Solomon. These are all themes that are going to come up again here in chapter 9. And so let's go ahead and just start taking apart chapter 9, and it begins, "Now when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to Jerusalem to test him with hard questions, having a very great retinue and camels bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind, and Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from Solomon that he could not explain to her. And when the queen of Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials, and the attendance of his servants, and their clothing, his cupbearers, and their clothing, and his burnt offerings that he offered at the house of the Lord, there was no more breath in her." And we'll just go ahead and break off there. In Klein, in his commentary, he points out, in the genealogical introduction to Chronicles, Sheba is listed as the son of Rama and the brother of Dedan. Rama is the 4th son of Cush, the son of Ham. But Sheba is also listed as the 10th son of Joktan, in the 5th generation after Shem. And Sheba and Dedan are grandsons of Abraham and Keturah through their father Jokshan. The Bible also mentions Sheba, who is identified as the firstborn son of Cush in 1 Chronicles 19. Compare also Genesis 10:7. In Isaiah 43:3, Egypt, Cush, Sudan, and Sheba are associated with one another, leading to the idea that Sheba was in northeastern Africa, possibly in modern-day Ethiopia. Sheba and Sheba are listed together in Psalm 72:10, whose title relates it to Solomon. "May the kings of Tarshish and of the isles render him tribute. May the kings of Sheba and Sheba bring gifts." And concerning this language here of the fame of Solomon, it's literally here that she heard the hearing of Solomon. As you can note here, the highlighted term, you might recognize the term Shema. Hear Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, right? So it is that term for hear. So she heard the hearing of Solomon and came to Jerusalem to test him with hard questions. And this language here is often translated as riddle or something to that effect. You get that in Proverbs, and you get that a couple of other places. Samson, for instance, as well as Daniel. And even here in the Deuterocanon, or the Apocrypha here, and it's going to be the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 8, I think. And here it's speaking of personified wisdom. "If a man desire much experience, she knoweth things of old, and conjectureth aright what is to come. She knoweth the subtleties of speeches, and can expound dark sentences. She foreseeth signs and wonders, and the events of seasons and times." It has here some of that same language. I don't have the reverse interlinear to point out exactly the same language, but this is the same language that's being used. And so there is this association between wisdom and this understanding of riddles and so on and so forth. And of course, Solomon here has the wisdom of God to know these things. And picking up here with the language of the spices and the gold and precious stones, Klein points out here, spices tend to confirm the queen's place of origin. In his oracle against Tyre, Ezekiel notes that the merchants of Sheba and Ramah traded with Tyre, exchanging for its wares the best of all kinds of spices and all precious stones and gold. Hezekiah showed off his collection of spices to the delegation from Babylon. 3rd Isaiah speaks of the camels of Midian, Ephah, and Sheba, which will bring gold and frankincense to Jerusalem. And similarly, Dillard points out here that frankincense and myrrh were in high demand for its use in pharmacopoeia and cosmetics, embalming, and primarily as part of religious offerings. The demand and the repeated taxation along the route contribute to the extraordinary cost. It was indeed the case that frankincense and myrrh could rank alongside gold as gifts fit for a king, obviously, in the gospel narratives. And concerning this language here of gold, Lightheart points out here, it's because it's used repeatedly, especially you noted further down here, that in the section spanning from verse 18, chapter 8, verse 18 through 924, that the term occurs 17 times, which Lightheart points out is the value for the term glory, as well as we've noted many times also the value, one of the values of the divine name. And here, Lightheart gives the rough outline of this section. Again, that's this same section spanning from chapter 8 into chapter 9. And so you begin and end with the references to gold and Sheba, as well as Hiram. But Lightheart writes, the structural connection is not random. The sea represents the Gentiles, and so Sheba and Hiram. And Solomon's sea ventures symbolize the international reach of Solomon's reign. For ships to travel from land out to sea is for Israel to move out into the world of the Gentiles. There is another typological overlay. The mining and shipping gold from Ophir, Solomon replicates the organization and program of the original creation. Eden was rich with food, but gold was outside Eden in the land of Havilah. And we noted some of this language back in the end of chapter 8. Adam was called to follow Eden's rivers to Havilah, so he could bring gold into Eden to adorn the Lord's sanctuary. Solomon with his gold transporting ships is another Adam, fetching gold from distant lands to adorn the glorified Eden of the temple. And so this fits with a lot of things that we've been looking at, especially in Solomon's reign. Of course, the creation, construction of the temple, mirrors the Garden of Eden, so on and so forth. In picking up in verse 2, and Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from Solomon that he could not explain to her. And Lightheart writes, the verb nagad is the root nagid, announced one, a term regularly used for a crown prince or for Israel's king who serves under High King Yahweh. Solomon proves himself a genuine nagid by his capacity to nagad every word or thing that Queen Sheba asks. The Septuagint got it right by translating it with onengailen from the same root as angelos, you might recognize here angel or messenger, and related it to euangelion, that is gospel. That is, after all, a gospel account. Queen Sheba hears a hearing about a wise king in Jerusalem. There is good news of a divinely wise king, and this king announces hidden mysteries. And of course, she brings him gifts, mirroring the Magi, bringing gifts to Jesus, the personified wisdom incarnate. And here, I think I made this translation here, but literally this is how this line is rendered out, because it forms, just in this verse alone, has this chiastic structure to it, where everything matches very well. So more literally, to bring out those connections, it would read something like, and answered Solomon all her words. There was no hidden word to Solomon that he could not answer to her. And so you have the mirroring answer, nagad. You have reference to Solomon. You have all her words, which is debar. And then in the center, nothing hidden. But that verse 2, is a very perfectly paralleled sentence. And then here I have a note that points out that Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon, so on and so forth, that she sees here 7 different things, which is maybe of note. Now, there's a bit of debate on this line here and his burnt offerings that he offered at the house of the Lord. In fact, this is verse 4. Let's go ahead and run a text comparison. And we're noting here the latter part of this sentence. So the NASB 95 has, and his stairway by which he went up to the house of the Lord. So instead of burnt offerings, it has him going up. That is Solomon ascending a staircase. The King James 1900 has ascent, by which he went up to the house of the Lord. LEB goes with burnt offerings. NRSV, I believe, also has burnt offerings. And so that's the debate about this, is whether it's referring to ascensions as in burnt offerings, or whether it's Solomon who's ascending in some kind of processional sense. I wonder if I just noticed it right now, but I wonder if Aaliyah, the R&B singer, if her name isn't based off of this idea of ascension, the Hebrew term here. But we've noted a couple of different times how you'll have this wordplay going on. In fact, we noted it last chapter, in chapter 8, where you had the drafted labor, how they were not drafted, they were literally ascended into this work. So that's part of the confusion here. And Williamson, in his commentary, notes that the MT, the Masoretic text, here has his roof chamber. So that's how he goes with it. Either RSV, and I believe the ESV is the same thing, should be followed, or perhaps both passages should be slightly amended. Because if you go with a slightly different lettering, if you amend the text, you could get this reference here to his stairway by which he went up, or perhaps more appropriately to the context, his ascent. The reference would then be to the great processionals, so some kind of processional thing where they have all the servants, the attendants, and so on and so forth. So that's why you might see a different translation in this particular section. And then it concludes here that there was no more breath in her. Of course, literally here it's ruah. And so I'm pointing out here that in Joshua, you have another Gentile here. Rahab reports the people of Jericho's hearts melted, and there was no more ruah left in them. So again, no more spirit. And the same phrase, or phrases, are used in Joshua 5:1, when the Amorites and the Canaanites hear of the crossing of Jordan. You get that same language of there was no more breath in them. But just kind of interesting. I wonder if there might be some kind of connection going on with Rahab, the way she's portrayed and the way Sheba is portrayed here. Because certainly in the case of Rahab, there is a sense of submission to the true God. And I'm wondering if that's maybe not the intent here in the way that this is portrayed in Chronicles. But continuing on, verse 5, and she said to the king, the report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and of your wisdom. But I did not believe the reports until I came and my own eyes had seen it. And behold, half the greatness of your wisdom was not told to me. You surpassed the reports that I heard. Happy are your wives, happy are these your servants, who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Verse 8, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on his throne as king for the Lord your God, because your God loved Israel and will establish them forever. He has made you king over them that you may execute justice and righteousness. And then she's going to continue to give gifts, but her assessment here, as she praises Solomon, is 68, or 4 times 17 words. Again, a divine number, multiple. And there's a repeated punning going on between the term for report and words. So as you can see down here, that this more literally would be translated something like the word, or the words were true that I heard in my own land of your words and your wisdom. And then you also have a pun in verse 6. I did not believe the reports. The term here for believe, as you can see, there's this similar root to true. So the aleph, mem, tet. And then in verse 7, there's debate about this phrase, happy are your wives, because as Klein here is going to point out, the alternate reading for the word your people. So that's another way you could translate. In fact, the footnote here has Hebrew men. But back to Klein, he says, the alternate reading for the word your people that has often been suggested, your women, makes little sense in Kings, where Solomon is reproved for his women in chapter 11, a chapter not included in Chronicles. It would also be the first mention of Solomon's wives in this pericope. The standing of his servants before Solomon echoes the attendance of his servants in verse 4. But the point is, it is kind of odd because Solomon has only been mentioned of having the one wife, the daughter of Pharaoh. So it is a little odd. So perhaps it should be understood as a reference to his men, to Solomon's men, his servants. And also of note here, you have a reference in her statement to the throne of the Lord and Solomon sitting on that throne. So the king sitting on the Lord's throne, that kind of idea. Moving down to verse 9, then she gave the king 120 talents of gold and a very great quantity of spices and precious stones. There were no spices such as those that the queen of Sheba gave to Solomon. And this comes from Lightheart. Interesting point. He says Queen Sheba's reaction is total. She hears, sees, confesses, and gives tribute. And I thought this was of note here, that this term here for spices, that the lemma, the root here, only occurs 30 times in 26 verses, most often in sacrificial contexts. It also occurs 7 times in Song of Solomon. I just thought that was interesting. I was very surprised at how rare this language of spices actually is, and the fact that it tends to be more sacrificial, as well as its associations with the Song of Solomon. All of those may be ideas worth pursuing. And then the narrative kind of briefly moves back over to Hiram, whereas the servants of Hiram and the servants of Solomon, who brought gold from Ophir, brought algum wood and precious stones. And Lightheart's going to write about this earlier in his commentary when he's noting the chiastic structure here, that these two sections, going back in chapter 2 and then here linking back up in chapter 8, as well as here our reference in chapter 9, that B prime is concerned mainly with Sheba's royal visit to Solomon. That story is framed by references to Hurim of Tyre. These sections are also dramatically linked by Gentile confessions of Yahweh's supremacy. Hurim says, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Israel, who has made heaven and earth, and who has given King David a wise son," addressing God as Yahweh, the God of Israel, a divine title that is unique in Scripture. Sheba echoes Hurim, "Blessed be Yahweh, your God who delighted in you, setting you on his throne as king for Yahweh, your God, because your God loved Israel." Strikingly, only Hurim and Sheba speak explicitly about Yahweh's love for his people. And then the conclusion of the narrative, "And King Solomon gave to the queen of Sheba all that she desired, whatever she asked, besides what she had brought to the king. So she turned and went back to her own land with her servants." And I think this is Williamson here. He notes the text of this verse differs a little from 1 Kings 10:13 and is not easy to construe. The NAB's rendering is as good as any. Whatever she asked besides his gifts in return for what she had brought him. There's actually a lot of debate about the verse because it is construed kind of weird. And it is also of note, even though there probably isn't anything historically reliable about it, but you did have an Ethiopian monarchy that was connected to Solomon by way of Sheba, and it really comes from this verse. They read quite a lot into Solomon gave to the queen all that she desired. Of course, the interpretation is this idea that, well, she desired a child, and so he had a child with her, and that becomes this monarchy. And so you do have people that traced their lineage back to Solomon. In fact, I think part of that was only recently dissolved in the modern era. But just worth note, that is where some of the idea comes from. And now verse 13 and following, which deals mostly with Solomon's wealth. I do have this note on the 666 talents of gold. Of course, that is immediately recognizable as the number of the beast. And there are those that would question whether there is something going on to connecting this Antichrist type figure with Solomon, in that, at least in the case of kings, Solomon is much more of a mixed bag. And he does plenty of things, including like amassing gold and chariot forces and things like that, which are things kings weren't supposed to do, as well as multiplying wives. So some would posit some kind of connection potentially there. It is also a, I believe, double triangle number, which makes it an interesting digit. But here, Dillard points out that other scholars have suggested that the total was derived by adding the sums in 1 Kings 9:28, 9:14, and 10:10. So that equals 660. But, as Dillard points out, not only does the total not precisely agree, which I think isn't really that big of a deal, that's pretty close, but maybe more importantly, these incidental payments should not be regarded as annual sums. But there are some that try to connect this back to some of the other payments. And then down in verse 16, you have these 300 shields of beaten gold, and the king put them, that is the shields, in the house of the forest of Lebanon, which always sounded kind of cool to me. Klein writes that these shields were put into the house of the forest of Lebanon, the account of whose construction in 1 Kings 7:2-5 was not included in Chronicles. So again, just another of these details that the chronicler just assumes you know about. That house was 100 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Its distinguishing feature, from which it may have gotten its name, was its 45 pillars. It is appropriately considered here to be an armory or arsenal. Such a use is ascribed to the house of the forest in Isaiah 22:8 and compare Nehemiah 3:9. And the reference in Isaiah 22:8 reads, "He removed the protection of Judah. You looked in that day to the armor of the house of the forest." Now in verse 17 and following here to about verse 19 or 20 is a description of Solomon's throne. I do want to pick up on this point by Klein. He says, Metzger's choosing of a ziggurat-like layout with the steps on 3 sides permitted him to imagine lions of sufficient size standing in pairs on each of the stairs facing toward the front parallel to the king. Now, I snipped out a section of Metzger's book on this. It's one of those scholarly books in German, but I did snippet out a large section that deals with the pages or the reliefs, the images, that many of which concern this section. But it's on the Ko-Fi page. It's been there for a couple days, but that one's behind a paywall. Now, if you're super poor and you ask nicely, I guess I could send it to you. But there are quite a bit of different depictions that may or may not be close to what Solomon's throne looked like. Now moving down to verse 20, it has this idea that the silver was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon, for the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish used to come bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. But Dillard writes in his commentary on page 157, scholars have often suggested that though the term Tarshish was originally a geographical name, it came to be applied to a type of ship used on long journeys. However, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that the chronicler considered these ships as traveling to Tarshish. It is not necessary to conclude that the author was ignorant either of the type of vessel or of the geography. Whatever the original meaning of the term, by the author's time it appears to have become a popular designation of a fabled distant place, roughly equivalent of going to the ends of the earth. He says, compare Psalm 72:10, which is a verse we just looked at earlier. It reads, the kings of Tarshish and the isles will bring presents, the kings of Sheba and Seba will offer gifts. And also Isaiah 2:16 mentions the ships of Tarshish. So there are those that believe it basically came to be like a distant journey idea, maybe not a literal geographical location. And we'll go ahead and throw this in here concerning this translation here of peacocks. Williamson notes, the meaning of this word is disputed. Many commentators now favor the view that it refers to another type of monkey, though certainty is not attainable at present. So that's where people have moved recently into seeing some other kind of monkey in addition to the apes. And then down to verse 22, thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver and of gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses, and mules, so much year by year. And Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots, and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities with the king in Jerusalem. And he ruled over all the kings from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone. And he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Shephelah. And horses were imported for Solomon from Egypt and from all lands. But concerning this language of all the kings of the earth, Han has a good commentary here on this, because this loops back into some of the earlier things in 2 Chronicles. But Han writes, there is a similar missionary element in the worship of the chronicler's temple. Solomon in his dedication prayer speaks of foreigners as hearing of God's great name and his mighty hand and outstretched arm, all his deeds of salvation. The temple, as Solomon envisions it, is to be the house of prayer for all people, a place where God displays his goodness and his reign over creation, that all the peoples of the earth may know thy name and fear thee, as do thy people Israel. And this comes out of 2 Chronicles 6. This is a remarkable statement of universalism. Placed on the lips of Solomon, it anticipates Isaiah's prophecies that the nations, even the traditional enemies of Israel, would one day stream to Zion to worship before God. And you get a lot of that in Isaiah, Jeremiah. And as the chronicler's account of Solomon's reign began with the foreign kings praising the Lord God of Israel in 2 Chronicles, it concludes by observing Solomon's benevolent rule over all the kings of the earth, who bring him tributes of gold, myrrh, spices, and more. And that is really interesting, too, that you have this all the kings of the earth language. And again, it also goes back to some of the spices and gold. Again, the gifts given to the infant Jesus. And it's maybe of note here that the gifts that are brought to Solomon, articles of silver and gold, so on and so forth, that it is 7 items that they bring. Again, very often in these lists, you'll have a 7. And maybe also of note is this section here that is noting the admiration of Solomon by the kings of the earth is itself a multiple of a divine number, 78 words, 3 times 26. And this is an image from Dillard's commentary, where he discusses the variant numbers in the Chronicles and Kings account, and basically he concludes it's not really possible to speak with confidence regarding what the original text had, again, because of the discrepancies and how exactly this all pans out. There's actually quite a bit of discussion on this issue, which I just don't care about, but this concluding statement is of interest by repeating the reference to Solomon's horses here and in chapter 1, verse 14, and his wealth in silver and gold, 927 and 115. The chronicler further perfects the rhetorical symmetry of his entire account of Solomon's reign. So this is kind of like the nice bow being put on top of this chiastic structure. And Lightheart notes here that this language here, stationed, is related actually to the word for Noah, or, the idea of rest, right? So these chariots rested here. And then now the concluding verses, verse 29, now the rest of the acts of Solomon from first to last, are they not written in the history of Nathan the prophet, and in the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, and in the visions of Iddo the seer concerning Jeroboam the son of Nebat? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years, and Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. Commenting here on the contrasting last words about Solomon in Kings and Chronicles, Dillard writes in his commentary, the compiler of Kings wrote a tract for exiles, answering to the why for the great exile and captivity and judgment to which even David and Solomon contributed. The chronicler provided a description of the past in terms of his aspirations for the future. I thought this was really a nice way of putting this, because this is an issue that's going to come up very shortly here in the next chapter. And of course, it's an issue that comes up throughout Chronicles, the difference between Kings and Chronicles and the theology that's going on. But we'll save that discussion for next chapter. But also here, we have Nathan the prophet and his prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite. And Dillard writes in his commentary, the involvement of Nathan and Ahijah in the affairs of the kingdom is well attested. Works by or concerning both are elsewhere appealed to by the chronicler as his sources. Though Iddo is cited as an authority for the chronicler's account of the reigns of Solomon, Rehoboam, and Abijah, nothing is known of his personal activities, since he is said to have had visions concerning Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. It is tempting to equate him with the unknown prophet who speaks against the altar in Bethel in 1 Kings 13. And in fact, this identification, as he points out, was already made as early as Josephus. And so ends the reign of Solomon. And though if you're familiar with Kings, the cracks were already beginning with David and Solomon. But for the chronicler here, things are going to go downhill very quickly, beginning with the reign of Rehoboam. And so chapter 10 and following will begin that downward spiral into exile. And we will pick that up next time.